History remembers the winter of 1342 as the year the wolves starved. But in the hidden archives of Oak Haven, it is recorded as the year the Iron King demanded a sacrifice only to be brought to his knees by a girl who couldn't even scream his name. In the forgotten shadows of the 14th century, beneath the guise of feudal wars and devastating plagues, a darker, primal society thrived out of sight. The werewolf packs of the northern wastes were not the mindless beasts of peasant folklore, but organized, ruthless dynasties. At the apex of this brutal hierarchy stood King Cedric Montgomery. Known as the Iron Alpha, Cedric had forged his empire through blood and ash. Historical accounts retrieved from the diaries of his contemporaries describe him as a towering figure of unnatural stillness, a man who possessed no capacity for mercy. He had slaughtered his own uncle to take the throne at 19, and for 10 years he ruled with a terrifying absolute authority. By the freezing December of 1342, the territory of Oak Haven, a prosperous trading settlement bordering Cedric's lands, had failed to pay its annual tithe of grain and silver. The winter was historically severe, the rivers had frozen solid, and the crops had rotted beneath early snows. The governor of Oak Haven, a cowardly and opportunistic man named Lord Henry Bassett, knew that Cedric Montgomery did not accept the weather as an excuse for treason. When Cedric's emissaries arrived clad in furs and black iron, they delivered an ultimatum that would be whispered about for centuries. Oak Haven would provide a flesh sacrifice. The terms were horrifyingly clear. If they could not offer gold, they would offer an Omega. The chosen Omega would be taken to the ironclad citadel, serving the Alpha King in whatever capacity he deemed fit. In the brutal politics of the Pax, sending an Omega to Cedric was widely understood to be a death sentence. The Iron Alpha despised Omegas, viewing their inherent softness and reliance on pack dynamics as a genetic weakness. He had banished them from his inner court years prior. To be sent to him was to be thrown to the wolves in the most literal sense. The selection process was left to Lord Bassett, a man who possessed no honor and cared only for his own skin. Rather than drawing lots fairly among the town's inhabitants, Bassett saw an opportunity to rid himself of a long-standing nuisance. Hidden away in the damp, freezing scullery of the Bassett estate was 20-year-old Genevieve Sinclair. Genevieve was a ghost of a girl, an Omega, whose lineage had once been respected before her family's estate mysteriously burned to the ground when she was only 5 years old. The fire had claimed her parents and her older brother, leaving Genevieve as the sole survivor. The trauma of the flames, or perhaps the unspeakable things she witnessed that night, had stolen her voice. She had not spoken a single word in 15 years. Lord Bassett had taken her in out of charity, a move celebrated by the local historians of the time, but the reality documented in the estate's hidden ledgers was far more sinister. Bassett had seized the lucrative Sinclair lands, reducing the rightful heir to an abused, half-starved servant. Genevieve lived a life of silent agony. She was beaten for dropping plates locked in the root cellar when guests arrived and treated as a lesser beast. Yet despite the soot that constantly stained her cheeks and the rags that hung from her frail frame, there was a quiet, unbroken defiance in her pale green eyes. She possessed an inner fortitude that her abusers could not understand. When the decree from the Iron Alpha arrived, Lord Bassett did not hesitate. He summoned the townspeople to the frost-covered square, his breath pluming in the freezing air, and read a fabricated lottery result. He announced with feigned sorrow that the Sinclair girl had been chosen. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the villagers. Even those who looked down upon Omegas felt a sickening twist of guilt. Sending a mute, frail girl to the cruelest Alpha in the known world was not a sacrifice. It was an execution. Genevieve was dragged from the kitchens by 2 guards, her bare feet bleeding against the jagged ice of the cobblestones. She did not weep. She did not thrash. She simply stood before the assembly, the freezing wind whipping her tangled dark hair around her face, her silence serving as a damning indictment of the entire town. On the morning the royal vanguard arrived to collect the debt, the sky was the colour of bruised iron. The ground trembled beneath the heavy hooves of Cedric's elite guard. The villagers of Oakhaven fell to their knees in the snow, pressing their faces to the dirt, terrified to even gaze upon the banners of the ironclad pack. Genevieve was pushed forward, stumbling slightly clad only in a thin tattered woolen cloak that offered no protection against the biting wind. She stood alone in the centre of the square, staring at the approaching nightmare. The villagers held their breath, expecting her to finally break, to beg for a mercy that did not exist. But Genevieve only squared her shoulders. She had survived Lord Bassett's cruelty for 15 years. She had survived the fire that took her family. She would face the Iron King with the same absolute, unbreakable silence. The historical texts describing King Cedric Montgomery often emphasize his overwhelming physical presence. When he dismounted his massive warhorse in the Oakhaven Square, the very air seemed to thin out, suffocated by the sheer crushing weight of his alpha aura. Men twice Genevieve's size wept and soiled themselves in his proximity. He wore a heavy cloak of dire wolf fur over blackened steel armor, his face a mask of sculpted ice and jagged scars. He did not look at Lord Bassett, who was grovelling in the slush, offering pathetic platitudes of loyalty. Cedric's cold, predatory gaze locked instantly onto the fragile figure standing alone in the centre of the courtyard. Genevieve did not lower her eyes. It was a grave insult in pack law for an Omega to meet an Alpha's stare, let alone the gaze of a king. The royal guards bristled their hands, dropping to the hilts of their broadswords, waiting for the command to strike her down for her insolence. But Cedric did not give the order. As he closed the distance between them, a shift occurred, a moment so profound that later chronicles of the ironclad pack would mark it as the exact second the Empire's trajectory altered forever. The wind shifted, carrying Genevieve's scent directly to Cedric. It was not the scent of fear, nor the cloying, sweet scent typical of Omegas. It smelled of wood smoke, crushed pine needles, and rain on cold stone. The mate bond, a primal mythical connection, believed by many modern scholars to be mere biological folklore, snapped into place with the violence of a physical blow. Cedric staggered a microscopic falter that only his closest generals noticed. His pupils dilated, bleeding the amber of his wolf into the dark brown of his irises. Mate. The word echoed in his mind, monstrous and undeniable. For 10 years, Cedric had built a fortress around his heart, ruling through terror and logic. He viewed the mate bond as a biological trap, a vulnerability that enemies could exploit. To find that the fates had tethered his soul to a starving, filthy Omega from a traitorous village was a cosmic insult. It was a weakness he could not afford. Cedric's jaw clenched. He masked his internal earthquake beneath a veneer of utter disdain. He reached out his massive gauntleted hand, wrapping around Genevieve's jaw, forcing her face up. His grip was bruising a desperate attempt to assert dominance over the terrifying pull in his chest. "Is this the trash Oakhaven offers its king?" Cedric's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the frozen ground. Genevieve winced from the pain, but her green eyes remained locked on his. She saw the flicker of amber in his gaze, felt the unnatural, scorching heat radiating through his metal gauntlet. She felt the bond, too, a sudden, terrifying warmth settling in the hollow of her chest. But she had spent a lifetime burying her emotions. She merely stared back, offering no plea, no sound. "She is mute, Your Grace," Lord Bassett stammered from the mud. "A defect. We thought she would serve quietly." Cedric released her abruptly, as if her skin burned him. Behind her hands, he ordered his captain, his voice devoid of emotion. "Tie her to the back of the supply wagon. If she falls behind on the march, leave her for the scavengers." It was a cruel, punishing test. Cedric needed to break the bond. He believed that if he treated her as nothing, if he let the harshness of the northern wastes claim her, the universe would correct its mistake, and he would be free of this crippling weakness. The journey back to the ironclad citadel was a grueling 3-day march through the treacherous Whispering Woods. Genevieve's wrists were bound with coarse rope, chafing her skin raw. She walked behind the massive wagon, her bare feet sinking into the freezing mud and snow. By the end of the first day, she was pale and shivering violently on the verge of collapse. Yet every time Cedric looked back, telling himself he was only checking the supply lines, he found her still walking her jaw set, dragging herself forward through sheer, unimaginable willpower. Her silence began to madden him. She did not cry out when the ice cut her feet. She did not beg for food when the soldiers ate roasted meat in front of her. Her quiet dignity was a mirror reflecting his own monstrous cruelty back at him, and it tore at the edges of his sanity. On the evening of the second day, a twist of fate intervened. The royal caravan was navigating a narrow gorge when the ambush struck. Dozens of rogue wolves, heavily armed and smelling of Bassett's treason, descended from the cliffs. They were assassins paid by Oakhaven's governor to eliminate the Iron Alpha before he could realize the town had been embezzling gold for years. Chaos erupted. Steel clashed against steel in the freezing dusk. Cedric, caught off guard near the rear of the column, fought with terrifying ferocity, tearing through the assassins. But as he dispatched 2 men, a third rogue massive, and wielding a poisoned crossbow, aimed directly at Cedric's blind spot from a rocky outcrop. Genevieve, tethered to the wagon just yards away, saw the assassin take aim. She had no voice to scream a warning. She had no weapon to fight. But the mate bond, pulsing with frantic, terrifying energy, overrode her survival instincts. With a vicious tug that tore the skin from her wrists, she slipped her emaciated hands through the bloody ropes. As the crossbow snapped, Genevieve threw her frail body across the icy ground, colliding with Cedric's legs, just as the poisoned bolt struck. Instead of sinking into the Alpha King's neck, the heavy iron bolt grazed Cedric's pauldron and slammed violently into Genevieve's shoulder, pinning her to the blood-stained snow. The silence that followed the sickening thud of the crossbow bolt was more profound than any Genevieve had ever produced. For a fraction of a second, the battlefield froze, the freezing wind howling through the Whispering Woods, carrying the sharp metallic scent of sudden tragedy. Genevieve lay crumpled in the snow, the heavy iron bolt protruding from her fragile shoulder, her pale skin contrasting sharply with the dark, rapidly spreading stain soaking through her tattered woolen cloak. According to the heavily guarded chronicles written by Lord Percival Kent, the royal historian of the Montgomery dynasty, what happened next defied every known convention of pack law and royal decorum. Cedric Montgomery, the Iron Alpha, who had never shown a flicker of emotion, while ordering the executions of warlords and traitors, dropped to his knees in the blood-stained slush. A sound tore from his throat, a visceral, earth-shattering roar that belonged to a beast entirely unhinged by grief. It was not the battle cry of a king. It was the agonizing wail of a wolf watching its mate perish. The remaining assassins, sensing the shift in the air, attempted to flee. They did not make it 10 paces. The historical texts detail a slaughter so absolute and brutal that the gorge was forever renamed the Traitor's Wake. Cedric moved with a terrifying, blinding speed, his claws extended, tearing through armor and flesh with an unnatural, furious desperation. He did not delegate the task to his elite guard. He executed every remaining rogue with his own hands, his mind consumed by a singular, blinding panic. When the last body fell, Cedric rushed back to Genevieve. He cast his massive, fur-lined cloak aside, dropping into the snow beside her. His large, battle-scarred hands, still dripping from the slaughter, hovered over her frail, shivering form, terrified to touch her, terrified to cause her more pain. Genevieve's eyes were half open, glassy and unfocused. The poison from the bolt, later identified by royal apothecaries as a lethal distillation of wolfsbane and nightshade ash, was already coursing through her emaciated veins, turning the veins at her neck a sickly bruised purple. "Maester, bring the Maester!" Cedric bellowed, his voice cracking with an unfamiliar terror. Master Reginald Caldwell, the chief physician of the Royal Vanguard, rushed forward, his medical satchel clattering against his side. He took one look at the wound and the spreading dark veins, and paled. "Your Grace," Caldwell stammered, his voice trembling under the crushing weight of the Alpha's frantic aura. "The bolt is coated in nightshade ash. Given her malnourished state, she does not have the strength to fight it. It is a miracle she is still breathing. I must extract it, but the shock alone might stop her heart. If her heart stops Caldwell, I will rip yours from your chest." Cedric snarled, his fangs fully descended, his amber eyes glowing with a terrifying primal light. "Save her. You will save her." But Cedric knew the physician's tools would not be enough. The mate bond, previously a source of bitter resentment, was now the only tether keeping Genevieve anchored to the mortal realm. He could feel her life force flickering against his own soul, a tiny, fragile candle struggling against a hurricane. Ignoring the gasps of his guards, Cedric carefully gathered Genevieve into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. The realization of how deeply she had suffered, how severely she had been starved and abused by Lord Henry Bassett, hit Cedric with the force of a physical blow. He had mocked her. He had tied her to a wagon like an animal, and yet she had thrown herself in front of a poisoned bolt to save a king who had treated her with nothing but utter disdain. "We ride for the Citadel," Cedric commanded, his voice cold and absolute, masking the frantic terror tearing at his sanity. "Now!" He did not place her in the medical carriage. He mounted his massive warhorse, holding Genevieve tightly against his armored chest, wrapping her in his heavy dire wolf cloak to share his immense body heat. The journey to the ironclad citadel, which usually took 2 days of steady marching, was completed in a single grueling night. Cedric drove the caravan mercilessly, his horse frothing at the mouth as they thundered through the frozen mountain passes. Throughout the desperate ride, he kept his face pressed against the crown of Genevieve's head, murmuring ancient guttural pack prayers into her dark hair, pouring his alpha strength through the bond to keep her heart beating. When they finally breached the colossal blackened iron gates of the citadel at dawn, the fortress was thrown into chaos. Servants and courtiers watched in stunned disbelief as their terrifying, untouchable king practically leaped from his exhausted horse, sprinting through the grand halls of the keep with a bleeding, filthy Omega in his arms. He bypassed the royal infirmary, entirely carrying her straight into his own private, heavily guarded bedchamber, a sanctum no one but his highest generals had ever seen. Maester Caldwell was given unrestricted access to the kingdom's rarest medicinal herbs. For 3 agonizing days and nights, Genevieve hovered on the precipice of death. The fever raged through her frail body, fueled by the toxic nightshade ash. Cedric did not leave her side. The administrative duties of the sprawling northern wastes were entirely abandoned. He refused to sleep, refused to eat, sitting rigidly in a high-backed wooden chair beside the massive 4-poster bed, his eyes locked on her pale, sweat-slicked face. The archives of the Ironclad Pack reveal a stunning medical intervention during this period. When Caldwell confessed that her body was failing to produce the antibodies needed to fight the remaining venom, Cedric drew his own dagger. Without a word of hesitation, he slashed his own palm, pressing his bleeding hand to Genevieve's lips. Alpha blood was a potent, dangerous substance, rich with regenerative properties, but highly volatile to an Omega's delicate system. It was a forbidden practice, an act of supreme desperation. Yet as Cedric coaxed her to swallow the ancient dormant magic of the mate bond activated, his strength became hers. The dark, poisoned veins on her neck slowly began to recede, replaced by a flush of genuine warmth. Genevieve's breathing, previously shallow and ragged, deepened into a natural, steady rhythm. Cedric collapsed back into his chair, dropping his head into his bloody hands. The Iron King, the tyrant of the North, wept silently in the darkness of his chamber, completely shattered and fundamentally remade by the mute girl who had broken his empire without speaking a single word. On the morning of the fourth day, the brutal winter storms outside the citadel finally broke, allowing pale golden sunlight to filter through the heavy velvet curtains of the king's bedchamber. Genevieve awoke to the sensation of crushing softness. For a moment, her mind, accustomed to the freezing, damp scullery floor of the Bassett estate, could not comprehend her surroundings. She was lying in a bed large enough for 3 people, buried beneath layers of down quilts and pure silk sheets. The agonizing pain in her shoulder had dulled to an intense, throbbing ache, heavily bandaged and smelling of sharp medicinal herbs. She turned her head slowly. Slumped in a chair beside the bed was King Cedric Montgomery. The terrifying Alpha looked completely ruined. He was still wearing the same blood-stained tunic from the ambush. His usually immaculate dark hair was disheveled, and dark bruised circles shadowed his eyes. He was asleep, but even in rest, his hand tightly gripped the edge of the mattress, positioned as if he was ready to shield her from a sudden attack. Genevieve reached out her trembling, emaciated fingers, gently brushing against his knuckles. Cedric awoke instantly. His amber eyes snapped open, blazing with a sudden protective ferocity, but the moment his gaze met hers, the fire dissolved into an overwhelming, devastating relief. He slid from the chair, dropping heavily onto his knees beside the bed. The ruler of the northern wastes, a man who bowed to no gods and no kings, bowed his head until his forehead rested gently against the mattress near her waist. "You are awake," Cedric whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse, stripped of all its former terrifying command. "Thank the ancient ancestors you are awake." Genevieve watched him, her green eyes wide with confusion. This was not the monster who had mocked her in the square, nor the tyrant who had ordered her tied to a wagon. This was a man utterly broken open by the mate bond. Cedric slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a vulnerability that made his chest ache. "I was a fool," he said, the words heavy and deliberate. "I let my pride and my bitterness blind me. I treated my given mate with a cruelty that I can never fully atone for. I tied you to a wagon. I let you freeze. And yet, you saved my life. You threw your life away for a monster who offered you nothing but pain." He gently reached out his massive hands, trembling as he carefully cradled her uninjured hand, pressing it against his scarred cheek. "I do not deserve your forgiveness. But I swear to you upon the blood of my ancestors and the iron of my crown that no one will ever harm you again. You are the queen of the northern wastes, and I am entirely at your mercy." Genevieve could not speak, but the bond between them sang with absolute clarity. She squeezed his hand, a silent, profound acceptance that sealed their fate. She did not need words to convey the sudden, overwhelming warmth blossoming in her chest. While Genevieve recovered over the next few weeks, learning to navigate the opulent halls of the citadel as its revered queen, the political machinery of the ironclad pack moved with swift, terrifying vengeance. Cedric's top commander, General Gideon Cross, had been dispatched to Oakhaven with a legion of heavily armed cavalry. The investigation into the ambush uncovered a conspiracy that rocked the foundations of the kingdom. Hidden in a false compartment beneath Lord Henry Bassett's floorboards, General Cross discovered a cache of ancient stolen documents. The truth, long buried in ashes, was finally brought to the light. The Sinclair family were not merely respected citizens. They were the ancestral rightful wardens of the Silver Peak Mines, the largest deposit of wealth in the territory. 15 years ago, Bassett had orchestrated the fire that killed Genevieve's parents and brother burning them alive in their beds so he could seize control of the lucrative mines and siphon the gold to fund his rebellion. Genevieve's survival had been a loose end he intended to exploit, keeping her enslaved and silenced through absolute terror. When Basset was dragged in chains into the grand throne room of the ironclad citadel, he found a scene that history books would immortalize. King Cedric sat upon his throne of blackened steel, radiating a murderous, suffocating intent. But it was the throne placed directly beside him that drew the gasps of the court. Genevieve sat there draped in deep emerald velvet and furs, looking entirely transformed. Though still slender, the hollows of her cheeks had filled out, and her pale green eyes held the commanding, unbreakable strength of a true Luna. Basset wept and begged, spouting panicked lies, but his fate was already sealed. Cedric did not order a swift execution. For the man who had tortured his mate and murdered her family, the Alpha King devised a punishment that perfectly mirrored the crime. Basset was stripped of his titles, his wealth, and his dignity. He was condemned to work the very Silver Peak mines he had stolen, chained in the deepest, freezing, lightless shafts for the rest of his natural life. He would never see the sun again, laboring in the dark to repay the wealth he had stolen from the Sinclair bloodline. Genevieve watched the governor being dragged screaming from the hall. She felt no pity, only a profound, silent closure. The ghosts of her family had finally been granted peace. That evening, beneath a canopy of brilliant northern lights, Cedric and Genevieve completed the mating ceremony, permanently tying their souls and their authorities together. The chronicles of Oakhaven and the ironclad citadel detail the decades that followed as a golden age. The Iron Alpha, tempered by the silent, profound wisdom of his Omega Queen, ruled with fairness and unyielding justice. Genevieve never regained her voice, but she never needed it. Her written decrees and silent commands reshaped the laws of the northern wastes, outlawing the abuse of Omegas, and establishing a dynasty built not on fear, but on an unbreakable, legendary devotion. The winter of 1342 was remembered not as the year the wolves starved, but the year a silent girl conquered the iron heart of a king. What an absolute roller coaster of betrayal, survival, and destined love. Genevieve's unbreakable spirit proves that true strength doesn't always need a voice, and Cedric's redemption arc shows how the deepest bond can thaw even the coldest, most tyrannical heart. If you were captivated by this intense, dramatic werewolf romance, please hit that like button, share this story with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, pulse-pounding tales from the shadows. Let us know your thoughts below.